Hello everyone. In this chapter of Life on Planet Earth, we are going to address the harvesting of energy that is needed for cellular work. In the previous chapter, we talked about the form of energy that the cell needs to fuel cellular work. That energy, we called it ATP, adenosine triphosphate, right? That is the currency of energy in the cell, whether we want to fuel metabolic work, mechanical work such as moving up and down, talking, right? Whether we talk about transport, right? All this work requires energy in the form of ATP. Now, where do we get that ATP from? And what is the process by which ATP is produced? That is going to be the purpose of our discussion in this chapter. Now, when we consider athletes, you have one of the sister Williams here preparing for a competition, and some basketball players here also playing games. Now, when you consider the amount of energy that is needed to sustain the activity of these athletes, when you consider the amount of energy that is needed to sustain your everyday life, right? You think all the time, you talk, you walk, you have many metabolic processes that happen in your body all the time. How do you get all the energy? How do these athletes get all this energy, right? Now, we eat every single day. We do eat every single day. Nevertheless, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, while the energy in the food represents energy, that energy is meaningless until it is converted into ATP, right? So keep that in mind. Therefore, you are going to need a chemical source of energy, that is the food that we ingest, and some additional component. And that additional component that is essential, it's oxygen. Now, the process by which we harvest ATP from the food we eat, it's cellular respiration. That cellular respiration requires input of oxygen. Now, when we breathe in, we are bringing oxygen. That oxygen is essential to fuel cellular respiration that occurs in our cells, and very specifically in mitochondria, right? In mitochondria, oxygen is going to be used as what we call final electron acceptor. I'm going to explain why in a minute. And in the process of cellular respiration, using source of food, that source of food is going to be broken down. At the end of the day, you have production of ATP, release of carbon dioxide as a byproduct, and water as a byproduct too. Now, for the sake of this chapter, we are going to focus specifically on the breakdown of glucose, glucose being a carbohydrate. Now, why do we use glucose in this instance? Because in the food that we ingest, a lot of the time, glucose, it's a major molecule that is going to be present in that food, and also the preferred source of energy for most of our cells. And not only us, but most living organisms are going to use carbohydrate mainly as source of energy, short-term source of energy. So that's where the cells are getting energy from first. Now, there are other forms of energy, but for simplicity, we are going to focus on the breakdown of glucose and how from glucose we produce the ATP that is necessary to sustain the cellular activities in our body. Having said that, when we look at the overall equation of cellular respiration, we notice that cellular respiration is actually the reverse of photosynthesis. Now, if you remember, photosynthesis is basically the combination of water and carbon dioxide, right? Using light energy as initial source of energy that is converted into ATP, and from ATP, carbon dioxide and water are going to combine together to form ultimately glucose, and as a byproduct too, you have the release of oxygen in the atmosphere, right? Now, when we look at cellular respiration, well, oxygen is an input here, glucose is another input here, and as byproduct, we have carbon dioxide and water, which are the beginning reactants for photosynthesis. So you see that we are going backwards here, right? So why do we breathe? When we breathe in, we bring in oxygen, we're bringing oxygen in. That oxygen is going to fuel cellular respiration. In the process of cellular respiration, we are going to break down glucose, and the outcome of that breakdown of glucose is carbon dioxide that we breathe out, right? So breathing, we are bringing in oxygen. Breathing out, we are bringing out carbon dioxide. Not only we, humans, dogs, cats, frogs do this, right? Other organisms also do this, right? Including plants, grass, oak tree, pine tree. Yes, they also do cellular respiration and release oxygen, release carbon dioxide. Okay, just know that. All right. Now, cellular respiration, it's a process by which the food we ingest, in this very case, glucose, right, is broken down. And as glucose is broken down, it's going to release energy. That energy that is released is going to be released step by step, slowly, not just at once. It's not happening at once. It happens progressively. How progressively and what are the steps? This is what we are going to cover when we look at the different steps of cellular respiration. Then eventually, that energy that is released when glucose is broken down is going to be ultimately converted into ATP. Okay? Now, for that to happen, you have a number of players. Some players that I would like to mention here are the coenzymes. Coenzymes are these cellular components that work alongside with enzymes. That's why we call them coenzymes, right? So they work alongside with enzymes. These coenzymes also happen to be electron carriers. Now, what I have not said is that when glucose breaks down and releases energy, that energy in reality is contained in electrons. Electrons that are very unstable, right? Now, these electrons are caught by electron carriers. Now, what you also want to know is that when these electrons are unstable and caught, well, what is also caught? It's hydrogen. Okay? Remember that the formula of glucose is CHO, where specifically 6 carbon, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. Basically, what you see down here. Okay? Now, when glucose breaks, at the end of the day, we have carbon dioxide, right? Where did the hydrogen go? Well, the hydrogens were captured by the coenzymes. What are some examples of coenzymes? We have NAD+. That NAD+, when it catches electrons slash hydrogens, I want you to remember that, they become NADH. There is another electron carrier that is involved in cellular respiration. It's FAD+. That FAD+, when it catches electrons slash hydrogens, they turn into FADH2. All right? So, there is no catching electrons without catching hydrogens. There is no catching hydrogens without catching electrons. I want you to remember that. Now, let's take a look at the equation of cellular respiration. So, a glucose molecule in presence of oxygen is going to release electrons slash hydrogens, right? In the process, glucose is going to become carbon dioxide, while oxygen is going to become water. In the process, you produce energy in the form of ATP at the end of the day, obviously. Now, another aspect I would like to explain here, it's that whenever the links in the molecule of glucose are broken, electrons are released. These electrons that are released cause glucose to become carbon dioxide, and that loss of electron in chemistry is called oxidation. A reaction of oxidation, it's a reaction in which there is loss of electrons. So that's one thing. The second thing that happens during cellular respiration is that these electrons that are lost are going to be caught, which means gained, by another chemical. And that chemical is oxygen. So oxygen is gaining electrons. And the reaction of gain of electrons slash hydrogens is called in chemistry reduction. I want you to remember that. Okay? So oxidation, loss of electron, reduction, gain of electrons. Now, that dynamics in the transfer of electron is very important in the process of cellular respiration that ultimately leads to production of ATP, because these electrons that are released are the one that carry the energy that when they release that energy goes toward production of ATP. Very important to remember. Now, what are the processes, or rather, what are the steps in the process of cellular respiration? There are 4 steps I want you to remember. The first step, it's called glycolysis. Glycolysis. Glyco means sugar or glucose in this very instance. Lysis is to break. So glycolysis is the step in which the sugar is broken. In the process, you have production of ATP. Now, while you have ATP produced, you also have release of electrons. All right? Now, as glucose is broken, it gets converted into a molecule called pyruvate. That's the first step of cellular respiration. The second step of cellular respiration and the subsequent steps are occurring in an organelle that we call the mitochondria. So, mitochondria. mitochondria. One mitochondrion, several mitochondria. Now, these steps are the preparatory step or the transition step. That transition step, it's actually a step that prepares the end product of glycolysis to enter the citric acid cycle. That citric acid cycle is a process during which much of the remainder of glucose is going to be lost as carbon dioxide. Now, I need to also mention that during the preparatory step, you have the release of a carbon dioxide here. Now, let's go back to the citric acid cycle. In the citric acid cycle, which is step 3, you not only have carbon dioxide that is released, but you also have production of ATP here. Finally, but not least, you have the electron transport chain that happens last. That electron transport chain is fueled by all the electrons that are released during glycolysis 1, the transition step 2, the electron transport chain 3, so that at the end of the day, you are going to have a bunch of electron carriers that are carrying electrons. These electron carriers are NADH and FADH2. These electron carriers now are the ones that are going to transfer electrons to the electron transport chain. In the process, ATP is produced at the end of the day and water is produced. Now, let's take a look at the amount of ATP that is produced from one single molecule of glucose. So one molecule of glucose is broken down. The first step, glycolysis, you have production of 2 net ATPs. In the second time ATP is produced, it's going to be in the citric acid cycle. You have 2 ATPs that are produced, right? The electron transport chain produces 34 ATPs. Now, think about it. 34 ATPs. So, as a whole, for one molecule of glucose that is released, that is hydrolyzed in presence of oxygen, right? You have 2 plus 2 plus 34, that's 38 ATP molecules that are produced, ideally, right? Now, imagine one instance that, someone ingests a poison. That poison interferes with the activity of the mitochondria. So the mitochondria are not active anymore. What happens? What happens is that out of 38 ATPs that theoretically can be produced for one molecule of glucose that is completely metabolized, you are losing 34 and 2, that's 36. You are only left with 2 ATPs. Question: if you have a business, let's take a look at things from a business perspective. If you have a business that technically runs with an outcome of $38 million a year. Now, because of COVID, you have a loss of $36 million. What is the likelihood that your business can survive after losing 36 million out of 38? Well, I think that if you are like most businesses, the likelihood that your business is going to survive is close to 0. The point I want to make is that whenever we ingest poison such as cyanide that interferes with the activity of mitochondria, it cancels out the possibility for our cells to access this ATP is produced during the citric acid cycle and the ATP produced during the electron transport chain, so that we only rely on glycolysis, which is not a very sustainable possibility. That's why we die very easily within 6 to 10 minutes when we ingest enough cyanide, right? So let me close that parenthesis. But as we go forward, I want you to ask the following questions. Of all the reactions that are happening during cellular respiration, what is happening where? So where is glycolysis happening? Where in the cell is glycolysis happening? Where in the cell is the preparatory step or reaction happening? The citric acid cycle, the electron transport chain. I want you to remember that and know this, right? And the other question you want to ask is, what are the outcomes of cellular respiration for every step that is happening? All right? Keep those questions in mind. Let's move on. So the first step we are going to make, it's going to be on glycolysis. Where is glycolysis happening? Remember that glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, so outside of the mitochondria. I want you to remember that. And the outcome of glycolysis is the production of 2 net ATPs, right? You also have other chemicals that are produced. We are going to go into the details of that. So now, glycolysis, it's multiple reactions. It's not one. Remember, we talked about metabolic pathways in the previous chapter, right? So multiple reactions. Those reactions of glycolysis actually are going to be basically divided into 2 steps. The first step right here is the investment step. Now, let's again think as a business. You cannot make money without investing money. That is not going to happen, right? I've been trying to make money without investing money. It has not happened, right? So you understand why I'm broke. But anyway, I'm just joking. So you cannot make money without investing. So the cell cannot produce energy without investing energy first. So you have an investment step. And then after investing, there is a harvesting, right? You have a step where you harvest energy, right? So investment steps and harvesting steps. So now, a cell for 1 molecule of glucose right here is going to invest 2 ATPs. These 2 ATPs, their role is to activate glucose. By activating glucose, so we have an addition of phosphate groups on the glucose molecule, cause glucose to become very unstable, right? That glucose that becomes very unstable splits very easily. And when it splits right here in the middle, right? When it splits, it's going to produce molecules, 3 carbon molecules, 2 of them, that are called G3P. Okay? G3P stands for glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, G3P. Okay? This glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is going to undergo another sequence of reactions, including here the loss of some electrons. Okay? So glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is going to lose some electrons that are going to be accepted by NAD+, so that NAD+ becomes NADH. So what is happening for this G3P molecule, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, is also happening for this molecule. So let's focus on one single molecule and the outcome of these reactions, knowing that the same thing is happening for the second molecule, right? So now the G3P, after losing electrons, becomes BPG. And BPG stands for 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Okay? 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. And why B-phosphoglycerate? Because you have a phosphate here and a phosphate here. Bis, it's 2, right? Phosphoglycerate. Okay? Now, at the end of the day, after this, we're going to have production of one ATP molecule here. Okay? Notice that you have an ADP that comes as input, right? That ADP is phosphorylated to become ATP. Okay? Remember of the cycle of ATP production from the previous chapter, right? Now, we are going from 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate to 3PG. 3PG, it's 3-phosphoglycerate. That 3-phosphoglycerate carries only one phosphate. So now one phosphate is gone to form ATP, right? And another phosphate is going to leave to form another ATP, right? So that at the end of the day, you're going to have here a 3-carbon molecule that is called pyruvate. Now, in terms of number of molecules produced, we're going to have 2 ATPs produced here and 2 ATPs produced here. Altogether, the outcome of glycolysis is the production of 4 ATPs. So 4 ATPs. But now, remember that at the very beginning of glycolysis, there was investment of 2 ATPs, right? So we have to subtract these 2 ATPs from the 4 so that at the end of the day, we have 2 net ATP that are gained from glycolysis, all right? So 1 glucose comes in, 2 net ATPs are produced, 2 pyruvate molecules are produced, right? Now, we also do have NADH that are produced, 2 of them, right? Because one over here, another one over here, right? So remember that, the input and the output, okay? So the question we have is that when we look at this step right here, so the process by which ATP is produced here from ADP, what is that process? That process is called substrate level phosphorylation. Substrate level phosphorylation means that you have this molecule right here that, remember, we started with glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, right? That glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate became 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. So this is a substrate for this big enzyme right here, okay? Now, that big enzyme, its job is to strip a phosphate from the molecule here to add it to ADP so that ADP becomes ATP. Notice how the substrate is now with one single phosphate group left, right? Using substrate level phosphorylation, again, this phosphate is also going to be stripped off so that at the end of the day, you're going to have pyruvate with another ATP that is produced, right? This is substrate level phosphorylation. I want you to remember that. Now, what are the input and the output of glycolysis? As input, we have glucose, For glucose, the output is going to be 2 pyruvate molecules. These are the carbon molecules that contain 3 carbon, right? Now, we have as input 2 NAD plus, as output 2 NADH. For ATP, you have 2 ATP that were invested, right? You have 2 ADP after hydrolysis of these ATPs, right? And finally, you have 4 ADPs and 4 phosphate groups that are transferred to the ADPs to produce 4 ATPs. Now, the outcome in terms of energy is going to be 2 net ATPs as outcome. Okay? So please review the slide by asking yourself, what are the inputs of glycolysis and what are the output of glycolysis? I will test you on that. Please review that. Now, the next step after glycolysis is actually going to depend on the availability of oxygen, because while there is a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, there is not always a lot of oxygen within our cells, within our body, or the body of a dog, or the body of a cat, right? Because when you are undergoing physical activity, at some point you start experiencing fatigue, right? So first, we are going to address what happens in absence of oxygen. But no, before we dive into what happens in absence of oxygen, let me first of all tell you that in presence of oxygen, what we call aerobic metabolism, right? Pyruvate is going to go in the mitochondria through the transition step. It's going to be converted into a molecule that is going to enter the citric acid cycle, and the remainder of cellular respiration is going to happen in the mitochondria at that point, right? But let's assume that there is not enough oxygen because we are exercising so much, right? Without oxygen, pyruvate does not actually go in the mitochondria. No, it doesn't. It stays in the cytoplasm. And at that point, that pyruvate is going to undergo reduction. Remember, reduction reaction, it's gain of electrons, right? Reduction reaction, gains of electron. Oxidation reaction, loss of electrons.